As a child, I faced abandonment because my parents believed I wasn't as intelligent as my twin sister. They favored her and thought I was a burden, believing she was more capable of achieving their dreams. My parents, both doctors, intended for my sister and me to follow in their footsteps. However, I never shared their enthusiasm for academics. While my twin excelled, I struggled to keep up with her and felt the weight of constant comparisons. In a household filled with overachievers, being average was not enough. From a young age, I learned that my worth was tied to my grades. The pressure mounted as my parents frequently berated me and praised my sister's accomplishments. Despite my efforts, I struggled in school and found it hard to focus. By the time I was in middle school at 12 years old, my grades slipped further, and teachers labeled me as lazy, oblivious to the distress I felt at home. Night after night, I cried myself to sleep, overwhelmed by my parents' harsh words and their declarations of love for my sister. One particularly difficult dinner ended with me being insulted over my grades again. In a moment of frustration, I lashed out, leading to 2 weeks of grounding. Feeling hopeless, I decided to run away, not knowing where I would go. I ended up at a nearby park, alone and scared in the dark. My parents found me there at dawn, needing to involve the police to bring me home. That night marked a turning point when they decided to send me to live with my uncle, my father's elder brother, in the countryside. When told about this decision, I begged them not to send me away. I promised I would do better and not disappoint them anymore. But my pleas fell on deaf ears. They made it clear that they had reached their limit, unable to handle my perceived failures any longer. They focused on my sister, who seemed to embody everything they wanted in a child, while I felt invisible. Despite my desperation, they ignored my cries and sent me away without allowing me to say goodbye to my sister properly. The journey to my uncle's home was heartbreaking. I couldn't stop crying during the ride, fearing I was losing everything familiar and safe. Being separated from my sister, the only family member who treated me kindly, felt unbearable. All I wanted was their love and acceptance, but I was haunted by the feeling that I had disappointed them too much to ever gain it back. For several weeks, I found myself overwhelmed with emotion, unable to stop crying as I longed to return to the comfort of home. In my distress, I made countless attempts to reach out to my parents, hoping to hear their reassuring voices. During this challenging time, my uncle and aunt stepped in to provide the support I desperately needed. They understood my situation and offered me comfort, but my parents remained unresponsive, ignoring all of my calls. As the days passed, I slowly began to accept my circumstances and tried to make peace with what had happened. Throughout this time, I managed to stay in touch with my sister, who was my only ally. However, our conversations had to remain secretive since she didn't have a cell phone. I relied on my uncle's phone to call her on the home line whenever my parents were out. Thankfully, social media was gaining popularity, allowing her to use their computer to chat with me. There were times she would let me know when it was safe to call, and during those moments, we would finally have the chance to talk and connect. Our bond as siblings remained strong over the years, and we continue to love each other deeply. She has kept me informed about her life and our parents for the past decade. Recently, she shared that our parents had been planning to reach out to me, which helped me mentally prepare for the possibility of reconnecting with them after being estranged for so long. For the last 10 years, I had no contact with my parents, a choice initially made as a result of their refusal to engage with me after I moved in with my uncle and aunt. Eventually, I too lost interest in reaching out, believing that they had abandoned me, and that chapter of my life was closed. Living with my uncle and aunt turned out to be a positive experience. They provided a nurturing environment that allowed me to thrive. Unlike my parents, who pressured me academically, they encouraged me to pursue my interests. My school performance improved. Although I was never an exceptional student like my sister, I was no longer failing classes. My uncle and aunt supported my desire to participate in school plays and sports, activities that my parents had deemed too distracting and detrimental to my grades. I was finally living a fulfilling life, free from the constraints that had held me back before. My parents had also enforced strict rules against talking to boys, believing it would interfere with my studies. In contrast, my uncle and aunt allowed me the freedom to socialize as I wished. This openness is how I met my husband, who has been an unwavering support in my life. We began dating in high school and quickly became inseparable, attending the same college together. I graduated last year, and just 1 week after our graduation, we tied the knot in a small, intimate ceremony. Recently, we welcomed our son into the world, a joyful addition to our family. Now, my husband and I live just a few streets away from my uncle and aunt, and we frequently visit them, ensuring our son has a close relationship with his extended family. I am currently on maternity leave, giving me time to bond with my newborn before returning to work. Over the past few years, my sister has openly maintained our relationship, feeling free to connect with me after turning 18. She decided it was time to stop hiding our bond from our parents, knowing they could not control her choices anymore. She stood by my side as the maid of honor at my wedding and proudly accepted the role of godmother to my child. Just last week, during a visit, my sister mentioned that our parents were planning to see me. They remained unaware of my marriage and the birth of my son. After their abandonment, many people in our lives chose to cut ties with them, which meant they had missed significant events and updates about my life. My sister had deliberately refrained from sharing any information with them when they inquired, feeling it unnecessary to bring me into their discussions. After a decade of silence, the prospect of their visit stirred a whirlwind of emotions within me, leading to a mix of anticipation and uncertainty about what would happen next. After a long span of 10 years, my parents finally began to show signs of regret for the decisions they had made and the actions they had taken all those years ago. They had been considering reaching out to me, and during this time, she felt it was important to inform me about their intentions. She believed that I deserved to know so that when they eventually contacted me, it wouldn't come as a surprise. A few days after her visit, my parents did indeed reach out to me through social media. Their message was straightforward and somewhat impersonal. They simply asked if they could visit, without offering any apologies or words of remorse for the past. I felt a mix of emotions upon receiving that message. To be honest, I was disappointed and let down because I had genuinely hoped they might at least acknowledge the hurt they caused me. I had expected some expression of regret or acknowledgement of their actions, but their message lacked any such sentiment. For a moment, I was so angry that I considered not responding at all. However, after some thought, I decided to take a different approach. I thought about inviting them over to my home, not just to show them my life but to demonstrate just how well I was doing without their presence in my life. So, I sent them my address and invited them for dinner one weekend. It seemed only fitting to include my uncle, aunt, and sister in this gathering, along with my husband and son, who were both going to be present since we were hosting the dinner at my house. I chose not to mention to my uncle and aunt that my parents would also be attending, aiming for a surprise that would leave everyone taken aback. When the day finally arrived, and everyone showed up at my home 3 days ago, the atmosphere was tense. It had been a decade since I had seen my parents, and the tension was palpable because my family had collectively distanced themselves from them, my uncle and aunt included. The rift was understandable given the history. My parents had once promised to support me financially while I lived with my uncle, assuring him that they would also maintain contact to help meet my emotional needs. While they did fulfill their promise to send money each month, they completely neglected the emotional aspect of our relationship. It became clear that they were just relieved to be rid of me, which understandably upset my uncle. He had taken a stand for me, confronting my parents about their absence, and because of that, the rest of the family decided to cut ties with my dad. This created a lot of bad feelings between them, but my father continued sending money until I turned 18, after which any communication between them ceased entirely. As we gathered around the dinner table, I realized I wanted to make a toast before we started eating. With the awkwardness hanging in the air, I decided to lean into it rather than shy away. I wanted my parents to feel the weight of their absence in my life, and I knew that this was my chance to express how the past 10 years had shaped me positively compared to the earlier years of my life. My speech was primarily directed towards my uncle and aunt because they had supported me tremendously over the last decade. I acknowledged and thanked my husband for being my rock and my sister for always standing by me through thick and thin. Throughout my speech, I intentionally left out any gratitude for my parents, and their reaction was telling. They sat there with their eyes downcast, embarrassed and silent as they processed my words. Once I finished expressing my gratitude, I decided to add a final touch. I turned to my parents and informed them that I was ready to introduce them to my new family. The look of shock on their faces was unmistakable, as they had not anticipated hearing something like that from me. I could sense that my family was taken aback by what I had just said. When I mentioned that I was embracing my new family, my mother's reaction was immediate and emotional. She broke down in tears and quickly left the room. The atmosphere shifted dramatically, and it felt like the tension hung in the air like a thick cloud. After my parents exited, the remaining family members and I sat down for dinner, but the mood was decidedly off. We exchanged awkward glances and struggled to make small talk, creating a quiet and uncomfortable meal that none of us could fully enjoy. Dessert was skipped entirely, and I felt a strange sense of relief. The weight of the earlier events made the idea of indulging in sweets feel inappropriate. Although I had my own complicated feelings about my parents, I couldn't shake the thought that my earlier actions might have crossed a line. I hadn't yet had a chance to talk to my uncle and aunt about it, but both my sister and husband believed my response was excessive. They thought that if I really didn't want to engage with my parents, I should have simply ignored their messages instead of responding in the way I did. To them, my decision to invite my parents over for dinner only to embarrass them seemed completely unnecessary. In the week following the dinner, I took some time to think about everything that had happened. I decided it was essential to reach out to my uncle, as the comments I'd received regarding my parents were divided on whether an apology was warranted. While opinions varied, everyone seemed to agree that it would be a good idea to at least clear the air with my uncle and aunt. I picked up the phone to call my uncle. Before he could even start the conversation, I expressed my regret for inviting my parents to dinner without giving them a heads up. He admitted that he was surprised by my actions but reassured me that he had moved past it. He had hesitated to reach out because he wanted to make sure I was all right after everything that had happened. We agreed that the situation had turned awkward, but he comforted me by saying it was all in the past now. I also called my aunt to apologize, and she responded similarly, easing my guilty feelings. With both my uncle and aunt's forgiveness, I felt some weight lift off my shoulders. However, as I reflected on the matter, I didn't feel the same way toward my parents. Given the hardships they put me through during my childhood, I found it difficult to feel remorse for my actions at the dinner. They had yet to apologize for anything, which led me to believe that I had no obligation to extend an apology to them. Discussing this with my husband was important. He had initially urged me to apologize to my parents. I explained that while my behavior at dinner may have seemed inappropriate, the treatment I endured throughout my upbringing was equally unacceptable. He listened and began to understand my perspective, deciding not to press the matter further. I shared these thoughts with my sister as well. Though she seemed uncertain, she ultimately acknowledged that it was my choice to make, emphasizing that I had been the one wronged in the situation. Throughout the week, my parents had been unusually quiet, so I assumed they were trying to lay low. It was clear they would eventually reach out again, likely demanding an apology or stirring up more drama. In the meantime, I wanted to clarify something about my sister. I recognized that she was not trying to be diplomatic just to maintain a relationship with our parents. I was okay with her decision to do so. I've noticed some comments suggesting otherwise, but she understands how wrong they were in their treatment of me. However, being younger at the time limited her ability to advocate for me. Our opinions didn't carry much weight back then. All I needed from her was her support, and she provided that by keeping in touch. The reason she continues to stay connected with our parents is quite simple. As they grow older, she feels a strong sense of responsibility not to abandon them. This is rooted in her belief that leaving them behind would lead to feelings of guilt. It's important to understand that her motivation is not complicated or deeply emotional, it is just a matter of familial duty. Because of this, it is crucial to refrain from making any accusations against her. Such claims are entirely unfounded and unnecessary. Our family shares a great deal of love for one another, which stands in stark contrast to the negative comments directed at her, making those remarks unjustified. Now, regarding the events that unfolded following the dinner I hosted, I had sensed a backlash brewing. As I previously mentioned, my parents are not the type to let things slide. They tend to hold on to grievances and react strongly, so I was bracing myself for some form of retribution. Predictably, it came 10 days after that dinner when they chose to go public about the incident, posting about it on social media. This took me by surprise because their online presence is usually quite limited. It seemed unusual for them to take such a bold step for this particular matter. Their post, however, was disappointingly one-sided. They shared only how hurt they felt without acknowledging their own past actions that contributed to our current situation. I found it somewhat ironic, as had this post been directed toward family members, I would not have been concerned. After all, my relatives do not have any fondness for my parents, largely due to their history of abandoning me during a vulnerable time in my life. What escalated the situation further was their choice to tag not only my coworkers but also my husband's coworkers in their post. It was particularly frustrating because my husband hadn't even been involved in this entire fiasco. Most of my coworkers were unaware of the strained relationship I had with my parents, so they were understandably shocked and they began receiving notifications about what my parents had said. Since I am currently on maternity leave, I had not been following social media closely and was caught off guard by the sudden flood of messages asking me to check the situation online. Initially, I was taken aback and didn't know how to respond. It became evident to me that my parents had likely gone to great lengths to find my colleagues' accounts by looking through my photos and posts. This stalking behavior only confirmed my suspicions that they had been attempting to undermine my reputation at work. After a few moments of disbelief, I decided it was best to respond publicly. I wanted to clarify the truth of the situation since I had nothing to hide. I explained that I was the victim in this scenario and detailed the events of that dinner, the history of my relationship with them, including how they had abandoned me at my uncle's home years ago and how their failure to apologize had only deepened the rift between us. I explained that had they taken accountability for their past actions, I might have approached our dinner differently. Once I laid out the facts, I also reached out in private to my coworkers who were tagged in the post. I felt it was necessary to apologize on behalf of my parents for dragging them into our family drama. They did not deserve to be caught in the crossfire of this conflict, and I made sure to express that to my colleagues. My parents' actions in this matter were simply outrageous, especially since they involved people who had no stake in our family troubles. I found myself feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. It would have been one thing if they had directed their anger solely at me, but dragging my colleagues into this mess was crossing the line. I was waiting for my husband to return home. I didn't want to disturb him at work, particularly because he had an important meeting scheduled with a client. I needed to process this debacle before discussing it with him. Meeting with a client today turned out to be quite an eventful experience. While I might have reached out to him to discuss the situation, I found that addressing this matter personally was more feasible. To put it frankly, this is just petty drama that I feel capable of managing on my own. I have already spoken to my sister about everything, and she completely agrees with me. She believes that our parents are currently overreacting, likely unable to handle what they perceive as disrespect, which has led them to lose control. While I can understand the frustration, nothing can truly justify the kind of behavior they displayed. I haven't mentioned any of this to my uncle or aunt yet, as I know they would react strongly to the news. They are really busy with work right now, and I don't want to add to their stress. Fast forward a couple of hours, and it's now 8 in the evening. The atmosphere in my house is tense. My uncle, aunt, sister, and husband have all gathered here to discuss how best to address the situation. I'm not inclined to seek legal advice, despite many suggesting it. The thought of filing a petition and dealing with the legal intricacies is overwhelming and unnecessary for me right now. I want to resolve this personally and keep lawyers out of the equation for as long as I can. However, if my parents refuse to take down the post that has caused so much trouble, I may feel compelled to consult an attorney regarding a defamation lawsuit, or whatever legal action might be appropriate. In the meantime, my family has been actively reaching out to them, urging them to take the post down. Unfortunately, our efforts seem to have fallen on deaf ears. They have not even bothered to respond to any of our messages. Adding to my frustration is the fact that the post remains online, and I worry about how it could affect my reputation. A significant number of people have seen it, including not just my coworkers but also acquaintances who are now asking about it. It's bewildering how this post appeared in their feeds, especially since I had tagged some people initially. I tried to remove the tag, but the post still circulates, causing unintended visibility. People continue to approach me with questions, which is becoming increasingly tiresome. They could simply read my comment for clarification, but instead, they insist on reaching out to me directly. I'm just hoping that this situation will resolve itself quickly. As I navigate these challenges, I particularly want to avoid any potential involvement from HR, as that would complicate matters even further. Protecting my work reputation is a priority for me, especially with my parents' actions hanging over my head. My family and I are brainstorming solutions to get the post taken down, and tomorrow, my sister plans to visit our parents. She will confront them in person, which might yield better results. If they still refuse, we may have no choice but to take legal action, something I sincerely hope to avoid. The last thing I want is to get caught up in all this drama instead of enjoying my maternity leave with my son. In an update a few hours later, I learned that my sister met with our parents for about an hour. I didn't know the details until she called me half an hour ago. She informed me that our parents are upset about something, which led them to make that post. It turns out they found my coworkers through extensive online searching, which was quite unsettling. While it's creepy that they went to such lengths, I'm just trying to focus on resolving this issue and moving forward. That situation was incredibly unsettling, to say the least, but honestly, it is not even close to being my main worry right now. My sister mentioned that she had a long conversation with them, and during that talk, they made it clear that they would be willing to take down the post in question. However, the catch was that I needed to apologize to them first. The moment I heard this, I reacted strongly and told my sister that there was absolutely no way I would agree to that. I felt it was unfair to apologize for something I didn't do in the first place, and I firmly stood by that belief. Thankfully, my sister understood where I was coming from and conveyed to our parents that, no matter the circumstances, I would not pretend to be sorry for something that had never been my fault. I expressed to her that they could save their time and effort. If they wanted the post removed, they should do it without any conditions. I was serious about taking further action, even considering involving a lawyer if necessary, and I made it clear that such a move would not bode well for them. Our discussion stretched for nearly an hour, but ultimately, they agreed to take down the post and put an end to the issue. However, they also instructed my sister to inform me that they would be cutting me out of their lives and, along with that, cutting me out of any potential inheritance. Honestly, I was unfazed by this news. What mattered most to me was getting that post removed, and I couldn't care less about their inheritance. It holds no significance in my life. My husband and I are doing quite well in our careers, and we are confident about our financial future. Even if things don't go as we hope, I am perfectly content. I do not need to depend on them for money. My sister reassured me that she also expressed the same sentiment to them, so at least they are aware of how I truly feel. Now that this matter is finally resolved, I can focus on enjoying my maternity leave with my son. I intend to cherish every moment and make the most of this precious time before I eventually have to return to work. I am incredibly grateful for all the support everyone has shown me throughout this situation.